Good evening, everybody. I'm Alicia Sams, Director of the Fellows Program here at the Institute of Politics. And tonight we are honored to welcome Senator Michael Bennet to campus for a discussion on the future of bipartisanship in America. And we're very grateful that he's made time to visit us on campus today. Yes. Just before we get to the conversation, I just wanted to tell you about a couple upcoming events. On Monday, Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who's the U.S. Representative from Connecticut's 3rd Congressional District, will be here. She'll be discussing her new book about the social safety net, and she'll be signing copies after the program. That conversation will be with Crystal Coates, who is our Director of Civic Engagement at the IOP. You can learn more about our other upcoming programs on our website, politics.uchicago.edu. After the conversation with Professor Oliver, we'll open up the floor to take questions from the audience. Please line up behind a microphone, which will be placed in the center aisle. And as usual, we'll give priority for the first 3 questions to be asked by our students. And please remember that a question ends with a question mark. Please take this time to put your phones on silent. Restrooms are on the first floor. And here to formally introduce our speaker is Michelle Shim. Michelle, I'm lucky enough to work closely with Michelle. She's our Fellows Intern. She's also a second-year student from Atlanta, Georgia. She's studying economics and English. And she has served as, I'm now getting to the part where I was supposed to wait and say she has served as a team leader for Fellows Ambassadors and is now our Fellows Program intern. Please join me in welcoming Michelle to the podium.
Good evening. In a political climate where bipartisan efforts seem to stumble and the urban-rural divide only grows and public trust in the Capitol seems at an all-time low, an insider's view becomes ever more invaluable. Here to discuss with us issues such as the significance of institutional norms, America's public education system, and the many challenges and opportunities ahead for all of us is Senator Michael Bennet. Senator Bennet, elected senator for Colorado in 2010, is a member of the Finance Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. He brings with him years of public service experience as former superintendent of Denver Public Schools, where he led reforms that prioritized student achievement, transformed lagging schools, and halted seemingly endless cycles of budget cuts. He also served as chief of staff to then Denver Mayor John Hickenlooper, balancing a historic budget deficit and implementing innovative strategies to make city government much more responsive to the wider Denver community. His diverse experiences have propelled him to introduce effective solutions to pressing issues. For instance, he was a member of the bipartisan Group of 8, 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, that introduced a bill to fix our broken immigration system. The Senate passed the bill with overwhelming bipartisan support. Also here with us today is our very own professor of political science, Eric Oliver. Professor Oliver specializes in contemporary American politics, suburban and racial politics, political psychology, and even the politics of science. He has written several acclaimed books, including Local Elections and the Politics of Small-Scale Democracy. He is currently working on issues concerning conspiracy theories, biological foundations of political cognition, and whether liberals and conservatives name their children differently. Please join me in welcoming Senator Bennet and Professor Oliver.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, and I especially want to welcome the Senator of the University of Chicago. This is also a distinct pleasure for me because Mike and I went to college together. He was a year ahead of me, and we were also in the same fraternity. And if you would have asked me 30 years ago, my 20-year-old self, that we would be here 30 years from now, I would have been cool. And not surprising because even then, Mike was, sharp as a tack and just a go-getter and just really impressive, but more that I would be here sitting next to him. So it's a great pleasure for me. You have an interesting career in that, unlike most of your colleagues, you came to the Senate without actually running for the Senate. You were appointed. And so probably in a lot of ways, you were almost a Mr. Smith goes to Washington type of figure. And I wanted to start off with, what have you learned, or what do you know now about the Senate that you didn't know when you first came to DC? Like, what has being there really changed your understanding about how the Senate works and about how politics works?
Well, thank you for letting me come, and I want to thank all of you for being here tonight as well. I know you've got busy schedules and places to be, so I'm very grateful, and I hope we have a really candid and robust conversation, because I think that's what this country needs. Sometimes people ask me whether I've watched that that program House of Cards, you know, that Kevin Spacey program House of Cards, and they say, is it really like that? And to answer your question, what I tell them is, I find that program more believable having been in the Senate than if I had never been in the Senate. Because you cannot, at this moment in the country's history, believe how much the equities run away from getting stuff done and toward political posturing that's not advancing the interests of the American people. Has that always happened? Sure, it's happened, but now we have a ratio of politics to getting stuff done that I think has probably never been more infelicitous in modern American history, not worse in modern American history, and that's something that I've learned. I've learned that the place doesn't operate with anything like the regular order that people might imagine, that is committee hearings and markups of bills and thoughtful consideration on the floor, but that things are jammed through in the middle of the night. And I've learned that we are not taking seriously, and I'll stop here, your future in that place, particularly with respect to fiscal matters, but not only with respect to fiscal matters. It's also true of climate and our investment in infrastructure.
So let's talk a little bit about dysfunction in the Senate. I think most people would agree that the Senate is not working well, and you're in this body. From the inside, what do you see as really the most problematic aspects of sort of senatorial dysfunction?
Well, it's changed over the time that I've been there. So the first term that I was there, I felt it was important to try to set an example of somebody who is willing to work with people on both sides of the aisle, because there was so little of that going on. My state, just for background, is there anybody from Colorado here? Great, awesome. Our state is a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third Independent. And in general, people want to see their elected leaders serving everybody in the state, not just one party or another party. There are exceptions to that, but that's generally true, and that's the perspective that I brought to the job. And so I worked with, it was mentioned, it was politely called the Group of Eight, but what we were really referred to as was the Gang of Eight, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans working together over 8 months to pass immigration reform in the Senate. We got 68 votes. It never was taken up by the House of Representatives. It is an excellent bill. I will not say that about a lot of stuff we talk about tonight. That was an excellent bill. It was an excellent effort. It should have gone on to be passed by the House. Same thing with work I did with Richard Burr, a Republican from North Carolina, on reforming the Food and Drug Administration so drugs could be approved more quickly for patients, and we can talk more about that if people are interested. Rewriting the Elementary and Secondary School Act with my friend Lamar Alexander, who's the chair of the Education Committee. I mean, all of that was going on in the first term, my first term. No one was paying attention to any of it, because all anybody pays attention to is the fight. Now I think we're in a different situation because we have a politics that is damaging the institutional infrastructure that the founders created for us to make decisions. So if I could I take another paragraph or two to
Sure.
So I think those people were geniuses. They were obviously not perfect, and there have been a lot of people that have come after the founders that have made the country much more democratic than the country the founders created. But they were doing something that had never happened in human history over a geography the size of the original 13 colonies. It was, and in fact, one of the strongest arguments against it was that you couldn't have representative government over an expansive geography. You needed the people to all be in a town so they could show up for the town hall meetings. And these guys developed the most elegant system, the only system anybody had for self-governance. And it worked on the inside and it worked on the outside. On the outside, they knew there would be, first of all, and this is important to think about in our current political system, they knew there would be disagreements. Because by definition, if you're living in a place that's self-governed, you're going to have people with different opinions that matter. Unlike if you have a king, that's the opinion that matters. And they knew there were regional differences, and there were big cities and rural places, and there were places where trade was really important and other places not so much. So they created a system on the outside that gave people the right to vote, not enough people, gave people the right to vote, created the idea of freedom of speech, protected the idea of the freedom of the press. And on the inside, they created a very elegant system of checks and balances of different branches of government to check each other, I think, as a combination, this is not a word they would have used, to create a way for a pluralistic society with diverse opinions to render judgments and to come to agreements and to forge consensus, knowing that there would be fundamental disagreements. The main problem with what's going on now in the Senate is that we are using that apparatus not to resolve our disputes, but to have disputes. And I think the reason for that is that the equities of fundraising and gerrymandering, the collapse of traditional print media, all of that, and the rise of social media has added up to create a just fundamental dysfunction at the core. And what I want to argue to you, and I'll stop right here, is that Ben Franklin was once asked, during the course of the pendency of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, he was standing on the stairs, and he was asked, what kind of government are you creating, Mr. Franklin? A monarchy or a republic? And his answer was, a republic if you can keep it. He didn't say a republic. He said a republic if you can keep it, because he knew and they knew, because they had histories of republics that had failed, that it was going to be up to every generation of Americans to make sure we kept the republic. And I think that's what's at stake now. This is a much bigger question for me than just the dysfunction of the Senate.
Well, let me push on this a little
Sure.
bit, because it seems from one reading, it's like you're complaining that the Senate has too much politics and that there's problems of money and there's problems of gerrymandering. But these have been chronic problems throughout the Senate. I mean, should we be shocked that the Senate has politics? Well, no surprise there. What particularly has changed since you've been there on those dimensions?
So there used to be a set of standards or norms that were followed as part of this apparatus, and those are often not honored anymore. So I'll give you an example of one where I participated that I regret. There was a moment in the course of the Obama administration that where Mitch McConnell was simply not allowing any nominations to go through. And they had already filibustered everything and all that. Then they just stopped letting anybody go through, judges and appointments to the administration, the executive branch. And we came under a lot of pressure in our party to change the rules of the Senate and to move it from a 60-vote threshold to a 50-vote threshold. And I remember Carl Levin, who is from Michigan, saying, who's one of the last people from that generation, saying, do not do this. This will be a huge mistake if you do this, because you will set a precedent that the other side will then use to, among other things, put justices on the Supreme Court with 51 votes. And we changed the rules, and Mitch McConnell pocketed that, and now the most recent Supreme Court nominee has gone on the Supreme Court with no filibuster, without 60 votes, because they changed the rules. And the Supreme Court probably in my lifetime, as a result of not this nomination, but the next two, is going to be infected by partisanship in a way that it historically has not. And I'll give you one different example, and that is the effect of the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, which is new to America. This idea that you can give unlimited money to super PACs and not tell anybody who you are in the name of free speech. The Supreme Court, when I was traveling the state in this last election, I used to say that the Supreme Court's majority opinion in Citizens United read like a 7th grader's American history paper or American government paper. And then I decided that was insulting to 7th grade Coloradans, so I don't say it anymore. But it is such a fundamental misunderstanding of the way our system works. And basically what they said was, look, we're going to define corruption as quid pro quo corruption. You give me $5,000 and I write a bill for you. That's what they imagine. Or I give you some money and I put it in my icebox in my congressional district and I write a bill for you. And they said, we have other ways of punishing that. That's corruption. We can punish that. So the Congress must not have been concerned with that. Congress must have been concerned with the appearance of corruption. And then they asked, does the appearance of corruption rise to a level of concern that we would want to erode the rights, in this case of billionaires, to give money to super PACs without telling people who they are? And their answer was yes. Colorado's answer is emphatically no, whether it's Republicans, Democrats, or independents, on the appearance issue. But what they missed was the actual corruption. It's not a corruption of action, it's a corruption of inaction. This Congress that is so scared to act for fear that if somebody says the wrong thing on climate, says something that's inconsistent with the, I would say, quite idiosyncratic views of the billionaires who fund these super PACs in traditional, conventional American political thought, that as a result of that, somebody will drop $20 million in their race, the next race. And it seizes up the machinery. And that's what's happened. And it's invisible to the American people. It's different than it's ever been before, I think.
Well, you touched on two things, and I want to delve a little into this. So the first one is Mitch McConnell. And on one level, we look at Mitch McConnell and we say, wow, Mitch McConnell, three-dimensional chess, genius. Let's give the example, held up Merrick Garland, which really stimulated conservative Christians to get behind Donald Trump because he was going to appoint a good conservative to the Supreme Court, and he helped Donald Trump get elected.
Yeah.
Flip side is myopic Mitch McConnell held up Merrick Garland, got conservative Christians behind Donald Trump, and now he's saddled with Donald Trump as president.
Yeah.
How do we negotiate? I mean, what is your view on this?
It's so hard, man. That's a great question. That is a great question because it's both and. I mean, it is a great question. The guy, with respect to, I don't think he'd mind my saying this, so I will say, with respect to Merrick Garland, was a diabolical genius. I think it was absolutely the wrong thing to do, and I think it is reflective of the anything goes politics that I was talking about a few minutes ago. But your characterization of what happened as a result, I looked at that and said, he can't get away with that. There's no way he can get away with that. We spent a whole summer as Democrats going around the country saying, do your job, have a hearing. But in that case, perfect example for the other thing, in that case, I did have a colleague that went home and said, I think we should do our job. I'm not going to vote for this nominee, but I think we should have a vote, and then I should have to come home and explain why I voted the way that I did. 2 days later, the Koch brothers said, not them directly, their organization said, we're going to put $10 million in a primary against you, and guess what? He flipped. So, and the second part is, I think that there has been a failure of leadership to respond to a part of their party that has created a alternative universe that can never be satisfied. And so I think when you're seeing Steve Bannon do what he's doing, and when you're seeing that John Barrasso, the senator from Wyoming, apparently is now insufficiently conservative, so Bannon wants to run I'm not making this up, Betsy DeVos's brother, who founded Blackwater, as the candidate, you sort of start thinking, man, this feels a lot less like the American Revolution, a lot more like the French Revolution. Because somebody's going to lose their head here. And they are being dragged so far to the right that it's very hard to govern.
But let me ask on this another thing. It seems like, from a political science standpoint, a little bit of a delusion. So there's all this fear about money in politics. But the Koch brothers their organization ran ads against you.
Yeah.
They've spent, tens of millions of dollars. They spent a lot of money in 2012. Didn't get much out of it. If you look at actually where big money comes in, oftentimes it's the threat of big money that seems to have much more of the impact than the money itself. And similarly with getting primaried, there are only a handful of incumbents who actually lose in primaries, yet there's this, I get the sense of this overwhelming fear of these primary challenges. And so they're highly, highly responsive to these bluffs by these various organizations. Why are your colleagues so intimidated by these fears?
Both of those things are true. But what you just said is absolutely true. And I think, and you asked why are people intimidated? I think it's because some people don't know how to do things that are hard. And tell me, Samantha? No, what was your name? Michelle, sorry. In her very kind introduction to me, mentioned that I had been superintendent of the Denver Public Schools, which is the best job I will ever have. And I'd love the chance to talk about it if people are interested. But it was a very, very difficult period in our school district's history, and we had to close a lot of schools. That is a really hard thing to do and makes it possible for me to see down the road to what happens after the inevitable confrontation happens and how you actually start to make things better. I think there's some of the folks back there just haven't had that kind of experience. And that's why we tend to do things like cut deals in the middle of the night, like the fiscal cliff deal, which you may remember from a few years ago, where we're simultaneously, when we've got a serious balance sheet issue, simultaneously extending 98% of the Bush tax cuts and allowing the across-the-board sequester to go into effect, neither of which is going to get us where we need to be. So we could use a little more leadership.
Well, why is, here's another sort of from an outside perspective. One reason why I think there's so much populist anger towards Washington is not, if you actually talk to the populace, they may say, they have a variety of reasons, but I think latent behind it is a sense of minoritarian rule. It's actually what's going on in Congress is not actually reflecting the majority opinion in the country. And I think it's some research that I've done with a colleague shows that where you have parties that are highly, highly separated, like in the early 90s, you tend to have these big populist uprisings. And then that was a period where there's big party divisiveness.
Where the parties
are separated. If you look at these things called like party unity scores, where the party, you don't see a lot of bipartisan cooperation. You had a lot of that in the early 90s. That diminished in the late 90s. And that was a period of Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot. And then over the past few years, this party separateness and party polarization has come back up. And then you're seeing these populist upsurges. And you would think that the party leadership, at least on the Republican side, following Roy Moore, and if you're Mitch McConnell, you can't get more unpopular than he is probably at this point, even within his own party. Why isn't he...
Even in Alabama.
Yeah. Why isn't he at some point figuring, well, why not be a little more bipartisan? Why not?
I don't
because there's nothing to lose on his point.
It baffles me. It baffles me. But
have you asked him?
I have, in the context of the fiscal stuff. I have. We had a conversation about it. I'm not going to say what he said, but I'm baffled by it, and I'm baffled by. Look, there's also a problem about in our time, which is specific, I think, to our time. Although you would know better than I would because you studied the history more, but. There's not an equivalency here between people on one side that are causing problems and people on the other side, in my view, and others can obviously disagree, and I'm happy to take any criticism or different points of view about any of this stuff. But there is a group of people there that reflect the views of those, or are aligned with the views of those people that are giving the money, who believe they've been sent to Washington to dismantle the federal government. They believe that is their job. It's not about cutting taxes. It's not about worrying about the deficit. It is about a, in my view, cartoon version of what the Founding Fathers were engaged in. And if you listen to their narrative of it, you could be excused for thinking that the Founding Fathers were engaged in dismantling a country rather than creating a country. That is what they're doing. And the Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives is doing that. And all of which answers the question that I had for years, which was, who in the world would want to work in a place that has a 9% approval rating, which the Senate does? And very often people say to me, how can you guys not see that the public doesn't want you to work together? The public doesn't appreciate the fact that you're pursuing a set of priorities, whether majoritarian or not, I don't know, but that's an interesting thought and reminds me of what Jefferson said about that stuff. But But of course they understand, except there are a group of people there. The answer is, yeah, there is a group of people whose purposes are served by having a 9% approval rating. It's the people that have been sent there to dismantle it. So you look at what we've done over the last 10 years with respect to the weaponization of the debt ceiling, the weaponization of government shutdowns. All of that stuff is not accidental. It is intended to make the American people lose regard and respect for institutions that you want to degrade or destroy. And that is a particular ideology that exists in our time that we're going to have to deal with. It's the reason why America felt, in part, maybe, okay with sending a guy with no apparent relevant experience to have the hardest job there is on the planet.
Well, on that note, let me...
On that cheerful note.
I was talking to my wife, Thea, last night, and I said, you know, what would you ask Senator Bennet if you could ask him? And I think I want to preface this by saying, you know, you have Bob Corker last week coming out, and, you know, a senator from Tennessee, Republican senator from Tennessee, who's basically saying that the president has to be contained and constrained and is pretty unfit for office. And so Thea's question was, and I'll basically just repeat it, is, why aren't you impeaching Trump? That's kind of what she would say. But I think that the more normal way of saying this is, why isn't there some recognition that we're actually in a crisis, you know, as far as that, and you being in a position to address this crisis, what do you feel you can do, or what should you be doing, or what are you doing?
I think I feel personally like my job has really changed from being that guy that was trying to find these solutions. My door is always open for business on that. But to being in a fight, and I think you're all in this fight, and I hope you'll be in this fight, to protect first principles that are really important in this country, like the rule of law, like our commitment to pluralism, like our heritage as a nation of immigrants, like the importance, and this is a really important one, the importance of the free press and the role that it plays. There is a daily assault happening now from the leader of the free world on the free press in America. And any student here knows, and any middle school student in Colorado knows, the difference between what happens when you rely on edited or curated content to produce your research paper versus relying on somebody shooting their mouth off on the internet. And I don't think, I mean, as a citizen, not as somebody in the Senate, I think it seems perfectly appropriate for us to apply that same standard that middle schoolers have to meet to politicians in Washington, D.C., and it would help a lot. So that's what all of us can do, is remind each other that we really are in this together. It is not something we can leave to other people. We are all Americans, even if we have even fundamental disagreements. But Jefferson told us that not every opinion is a principle. And at some point, we need the machinery of government to respond to the American people. And it's not okay to leave it to somebody else. It really is in your hands as much as it is in my hands. I really believe it.
But I want to push a little on this.
Okay.
So, you know, Bob Corker speaks up, and then there's sort of deafening silence from his Republican colleagues,
Yeah.
although the sentiment is that he's actually saying what they all secretly
Right.
feel. Are they waiting for the apocalypse to act?
I'm not gonna carry a brief for cowardly politicians. But you're right to ask the question. And people in my job ought to be thinking about it every single day. Everybody knows that the president has no idea or interest what was in the Republican health care bill. There's not a Republican that doesn't think that, or maybe there's 2, 3. But we're going to need them to speak up, and by the way, to answer your wife's first question, and for those of us in my party, we have to set an example, I think. And there are sometimes a lot of people say to me, actually, we have to give it to them just the way they're giving it to us. I think that's exactly the wrong thing for the country. I think we have to set an example. It's painful, it's unpleasant, it takes longer, it's not satisfying, it doesn't resonate on cable television at night well, but with respect to the question she asked, we should follow the process in the Senate. We've got an investigation going on outside. We have 2 intelligence committees looking at it inside. and let's see where it takes us.
You're somebody who is very well known for your bipartisan efforts, and you mentioned earlier Colorado being a very evenly divided state, and so you must do a lot to kind of try to reach across the aisle. One of the things that seems to characterize conservative politics more of lately, and if you think about like Roy Moore as being emblematic of this, it's a more magical, conspiratorial, fervent, what I would sort of call maybe an intuitionist style of politics that's not very pragmatic, not very consensual, not open to compromise. How do you reach colleagues, or how do you reach citizens who are caught up in that mindset? What are your strategies for communicating?
This is the sort of central challenge that we have. I mean, there's some strategies are to work well with people so that they'll want to work with you. And some strategies are to praise people, which I do. So I've said all over America and all over Colorado when people say, you're terrible, you deserve your 9% approval rating, there's no leadership back there. I know it will surprise you that people say that to me, but they do say that to me. I always tell them, I say, I've seen the example that we need. And it's no greater than the example that was set by Marco Rubio, Jeff Flake, Lindsey Graham, and John McCain, the 4 Republicans who sat in that room for 8 months negotiating the immigration bill. No, it's not like they didn't understand what the base of their party would say about them being there. It's that they thought they could withstand what the base of their party would say about them being there. And they thought they were doing something that was good for the country and something that was good for their party in that order. They could never have imagined Donald Trump, nor would I have imagined Donald Trump. They believed that they could not elect another president being so bad on immigration. Little did they know how bad it really was. So, and I do think it's the responsibility of citizens and of senators to push back on this. And I have had to say no enough times to people in my party in Colorado, and that's painful, and I understand it. And it doesn't make me right either. I mean, we could have a disagreement where I turn out to be wrong, but I've had to say no enough times that I know what it feels like, and it's made me impatient with politicians in Washington that can't ever say at a certain point, no, that is so far outside the extremes of modern American political thought that I am not pursuing that agenda. Or that there's virtue in standing on your principles. There's a huge amount of virtue in standing on your principles, but there's also virtue in actually solving problems for the American people. And we need to do both of those things. We can do both of those things.
You mentioned earlier, and I want to come back to this point, this idea of edited media, the difference between edited media, and we are now in a social media era. And I think one of the interesting things about the time since when you first came into the Senate versus now is this is really when this revolution has been happening for the past 8 years. I was wondering if you could reflect on what you see as both what would have been the principal problems of social media in that period and what you see as possible solutions or constructive uses of social media within that?
I think it can be used constructively to organize people. And organizing people is not a bad thing. Even if you disagree with people, at least they're active and they're organized. You can use it well for that. You can use it to supply misinformation that is misunderstood as real information and real facts. And that, I would say, is a huge danger. Everyone in the United States government, with the exception of President Trump, knows that the Russians hacked into our election and used social media to influence that election. That is an attack on the United States. And the fact that he won't take it seriously or he won't admit that it happened, even after we've all been given the intelligence briefings that told us about that, is worrisome to me. But it's another dimension of how social media has been used in a non-constructive way. What we have not figured out how to do is use social media to govern. And you guys are the ones that are going to have to figure that out. If you're relying on me, you got to figure it out. But somebody has to figure it out how to use it for a constructive purpose. Because we can't just ignore it. I mean, as much as if Walter, you won't even know this, some of you, if Walter Cronkite were reading us the news every night on, for half an hour on night after night after night, there's no way Donald Trump gets out of a Republican primary, much less wins the presidency. So we could disagree about that, but I actually believe that's true. That tells you how important this issue is. And in my own life, where I've reflected on this a lot, is when I was a school superintendent, I had 2 newspapers in Denver, the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post, 2 dailies. Today we have the Post, which is a shell of what it once was, and we have no Rocky Mountain News, which means the kind of pluralistic stuff the founders were talking about is happening less and less and less. They said they hated the newspapers, some of them back then, but their view was that reason would and a kind of a shared sort of understanding of facts would disinfect the wrong stuff that they thought the papers were saying about them or about anybody else. Ask yourself whether that's possible in the same way in the social media environment, or whether it's possible in the same way when you've got people spending the kind of money they're able to spend on our politics. I don't know the answer to that, but this is something at the core of what we got to figure out.
Well, one thing I'm wondering about this, I often think about social media as, I think of what it's done, it's, and the fragmenting of the media environment is that it's made public opinion less coherent. And I'm wondering, as an elected representative, do you find it harder now to get signals from your constituencies, from your state, about where people are?
I absolutely do not. And I've continued to do town hall meetings throughout the state. I've spent a lot of time, I probably spend more time in traveling in rural parts of the state than I have in urban parts of the state. And I do, I say at the beginning of the town hall, I don't give a speech, I just say, ask any question, bring any criticism that you have. I invite people to say what they want to say. And I guess I'll say this about my state, which is that I think there's about a 75% consensus yes on a whole bunch of issues, whether it's deep red Colorado or blue Colorado. If it's the stuff that's occupying the cable talking heads at night, there's probably not a consensus. But that's not the stuff that we need to agree upon to move the country forward. Infrastructure, higher education, the cost of higher education, K-12 education, infrastructure, what the country's role ought to be in the world. We can color inside some lines to get some agreement on that stuff, I think, and I think that's where people are generally. And what we've got to do is reconstruct our politics so it actually matches up to where people are, rather than pursuing a set of politics that is interested in the most extreme version of where we are, because I don't think that's working well for the American people.
Well, let's take the example then of current legislation on, it's supposed to be tax reform, but it looks like ostensibly like tax cuts. Why is this not getting reflected in the legislative proposals that seem to be coming out of the White House?
What I just said?
Yeah.
I think it's a combination of 2 things. One, there's nothing harder to do in Washington than tax reform. Immigration reform is hard. Tax reform is hard because the city is populated with a bunch of people that are there to keep it the way it is, because they've got an interest in the tax code from 50 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever. So that makes it hard. That makes it different than, for example, doing the Elementary and Secondary School Act, although we did do that 7 years late, but there's less of a resistance. And the other reason, frankly, is I think that there's a real question whether the administration has the legislative competence to do the work and is staffed in a way to do the work. I know the Republicans on the Finance Committee, which I'm on, do not feel that they've got the competence to do it. So where this ought to happen in a bipartisan way, and I really would like us to reform our tax code. I was in college the last time the tax code was reformed. That was like a million years ago. I think the place where that probably will have to start and should start is the Finance Committee. And I don't think we should be negotiating with the White House on it, because I don't think they're in a position to negotiate something that is going to be rational. And I believe in the members of that committee. Not every single one, but enough of them.
As a Democrat, you probably often get tagged with the stereotype of loving government, loving government, loving government. Just to not zig, but to zag a little bit, what would be some examples of government programs you would like to get rid of?
Well, First of all, you've put your hand on something that is a sore spot in our caucus, because I keep making the argument that they have become successfully the attackers of government, and we have been the unsuccessful defenders of bad government. So somebody once in our caucus said, look at this is the difference between us and them. This was after the Flint, Michigan water poisoning, the lead in the water in Flint. They said, we believe in government, they don't believe in government. And I said, you know, I realized it was a governor who made the decision that led to the poisoning in Flint, but that was government. And even before that happened, there was not a single school in Flint, Michigan that anybody in the United States Senate would want to send their kid. And that's government. And we need, I think, to dramatically reorient what we're doing in the 21st century. So there's every agency I would look at. And I will start by telling you, when I took over the Denver Public Schools, it had budget cuts year after year after year. We were dead last in student achievement of any district of the state of Colorado of any size. We had a huge dropout rate. I mean, the list that ails every urban school district. 10 years later, we were graduating and sending to college 70% more kids than we were 10 years ago. I think we'd be feeling a lot better about this country if we could say that about every urban school district in America. You can't say that about any other school district in America. But it required us to work incredibly hard to change what we were doing and to reorient what we were doing. And I think another place where I think we need to find a way to come to some agreement, and by the way, that district now has the fastest growing student achievement of any school district of any size, and it has had that for the last 7 years in the state of Colorado. And that's made a difference in a lot of people's lives. I'm the first one to say we have a long way to go, but that's made a lot of difference in a lot of people's lives, and we wouldn't have gotten there if we had left it the way it was. And I think, you know, I'm open to looking at all kinds of regulatory structures in Washington that are not serving the American people well, where there are regulations stacked on top of regulations that never go away because somebody on Capitol Hill insists that it stay there, or the president insists that it stay there. We also, I think, in this era, need to be thinking a lot harder than we have historically about what the role of government is as a partner to municipal government and state government, nonprofits. This is why I've become very interested in social impact investing and that whole line of thought, because we've got to be a lot more nimble now than we have been historically. And it's going to require us really to think about how to do it better, and we need to do it better.
Okay. I think now is the time we can open up to some questions. So we would invite some questions and want to come up. And if you could just introduce yourself, please, that would be great.
Hi, Senator. My name's Dylan. I'm a fourth-year poli-sci major in the college.
Where are you from?
I'm from New York. So my question is, do you ever run into issues trying to work with senators of whichever party who are more interested in making noise and building their personal brand, or running for president, more interested in that than they are in actually working on legislation?
Yes. Yeah, and you know, one of the things you learn when you're in this job is there are 100 ways to do the job, and it surprises me to know that a guy could show up, or a woman could show up with the title senator and find a way to manufacture that into a run for the presidency within a couple of months of them being there. But we've seen some of that, and it happens a lot.
Hi, my name's
You know, one of the other things that's not a negative about that, and this also goes back to the founder's design, is sometimes people are running for president, and sometimes people have decided they're going to retire, like Bob Corker you were talking about, and sometimes people are having a bad day, and sometimes they're not. But it's all supposed to kind of come together into something, and the fact that somebody is running for president may have to do something different is understandable. What's less understandable to me are the people that just are trying to throw a stick in the whatever bicycle wheel. Yes.
I'm a student at the law school. My name's Chris. It's a pleasure to interact with a senator from my home state. So thank
All
you for
right,
coming.
where are you from?
I'm from Castle Rock.
Great.
Yeah. And you spoke a lot about the links between primaries and sort of the push-pull that a politician might feel, and as someone with experience with running in a fairly contested primary, Mr. Romanoff, and also facing a candidate who was the product of a fairly contentious primary in Mr. Glenn. I'm curious if, say you were in charge of redesigning the American electoral system, what sort of candidate selection mechanism might you choose that wouldn't have those same exigencies if you could choose any that you like?
If I waved a magic wand,
If
I
you
would,
waved a
I
magic
would,
wand.
I would gerrymander every single district in America into the most competitive district they could be, rather than the least competitive. That's what I would do, and I think it would make a big difference.
And keep the primary system, or?
I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. On the primary system, I'm interested in what California has done in creating this open primary system there that takes the top two candidates at the end. And the reason I'm interested in that is that I worked in the city and county of Denver. You've done some local politics stuff, and I really had a wonderful time being chief of staff for our mayor, John Hickenlooper, who's now the governor. And in that system, we didn't have primaries. We had the equivalent of an open primary, and people just run no matter what party they're in, and you take the top two, and that seems to work really well. I don't know if it would work but now we get to see the experiment of California and figure it out. We changed it in Colorado a little bit, as you know. So,
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Hayden. I'm a second year in the college.
I know where to get really good pizza in Castle Rock, by the way.
I'm from Newport Beach, California. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for being here.
Senator. My question has to do with the recent list of demands that the White House communicated to Congress with respect to their DACA proposal in terms of enshrining legal protections for DACA members. I was wondering whether, in spite of the recent comments from Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, whether you feel differently in terms of your caucus being able to consider some of the requests from the Trump administration.
We have to solve this issue with respect to the Dreamers. There is no, I don't know how we could fail on this and look at ourselves in the mirror as Americans. And I say that not primarily in the job that I'm in now, but on behalf of the children that were in my school district and who live all across my state, who know no other country but this country. I can't tell you tonight how we're going to do it, but I believe we will do it. We have to do it. I'll say more broadly as a negotiating strategy, I think this is part of the sort of Trumpian way. I've never read The Art of the Deal, and maybe I should, but my sense from talking to people that were in the commercial real estate business in New York is that the way he negotiates is by taking a position out here, and then you take a position here, and then you end up not here, but here. So the initial position that he should have taken should have been here, not here. He's done that his whole life. The problem now is not only is he doing it with the Dreamers, which is, in my view, totally inappropriate, he's doing it with other countries. So when he says to Mexico, you will build the wall and you will pay for that wall, if that is a negotiation, what they're hearing is, what the Mexican politicians are hearing are from a whole bunch of people who are saying, we're not going to build that wall and we're not going to pay for that wall. And you better not enter into a discussion with that guy as long as he's saying that. It creates a domestic politics within the countries with which we're dealing that is not useful to actually advancing an agreement among nations. And I genuinely think he just doesn't understand that. He thinks that he's having a negotiation with the elected leader of Mexico. The elected leader of Mexico represents a bunch of Mexicans who can either vote him in or vote him out.
Right, so the problem I have is I don't understand why some of the Democratic senators are not able to consider the wall request or at least reinforcing the fence, because Democrats have a problem with being associated with the term open borders. Polls show that Americans actually want more border security. Is there a compromise that could be reached?
I
there?
helped, yeah, I would recommend that you take a look, and as I recommended President Trump, when I was the one time in the White House, recommended that he take a look at the immigration bill that we wrote together and passed in a bipartisan way in the Senate. The first two words of the title of that bill that I didn't just vote for, I helped write, are border security. So, and there are 700 miles of fence, there's $40 billion worth of border security, there's the use of drones. The list is long of things that are available to decide how to secure the border. A wall is not one of those things. And it's not one of the things that the Republican members of the Gang of Eight who supported that work, who had to go home to their constituents and explain what they were doing for Arizona. Not just that they had voted for a bill, but that they had written a bill on immigration, and they were able to go home and explain the border security elements. So I hope that the Republicans, Mr. Trump, will look at the things that we have in there. But more than that, what I hope is that he will not hold children hostage who know no other country, as I said, besides the United States of America. It's anti-American. And he has said it over and over again on the Dreamers. And now he shows up with a list of demands that are clearly meant not to get a deal rather than something that would produce a deal. So there's my candid answer to you.
Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Corey. I wanted to thank you for being a hero.
Where are you from? Where are you from?
Oh, I am a Gutierrez district here in Chicago.
All right.
As well as Genesee, Colorado.
Great.
I wanted to thank you for being a hero for America's national monuments. You are a hero for America's national monuments.
Thank you.
And tell us the story about that bipartisan win that you brought home to Colorado, because you wanted to protect America's national monuments.
Well, thank you. So we have we got two national monuments during the Obama administration. One was called Chimney Rock in southern Colorado, and one was called Browns Canyon, which is on the Arkansas River, some of the best fishing and kayaking and whitewater rafting in the world. And in both those cases, well, the Browns Canyon was really my partnership with Mark Udall, who is my senior senator Democrat. In the case of Chimney Rock, it was a Republican named Scott Tipton who represents quite a conservative district, and we just ran a local process like you would if you were doing the work that I used to do in the school district, and we had a lot of community support. And I will say, my Republican colleague in the Senate now, Cory Gardner, when given the opportunity to vote for or against the bill that the Republicans put on the floor, to notionally, or it's unfair to say it quite this way, but to suggest that the public lands of the United States were for sale, he voted with Colorado on that bill and against the Republican proposal. And this is something that we share. Yeah, and I should say also about him, where's my friend from California? There. He is also a co-sponsor with me of the DREAM Act. And he doesn't need a negotiation to be on that bill to do the right thing for the American people. And finally, this is so fundamentally important to our culture and our legacy and who we are, what we were given by our grandparents, and what we need to leave our children. So this has been a real joy in being in this job, has been working on this.
You're actually underselling your effort here, because I know that the Republicans caused a huge problem for the CEOs in America who were in outdoor retailer business. And you actually, instead of just saying Republicans caused the problem, you actually came with a bipartisan solution. And you actually shook hands with the Colorado Republicans to bring those CEOs, to have them follow you to Colorado. Right,
and so that's the end point of this story is, because we were fighting for Bears Ears and doing all kinds of other stuff, my colleague, the Republican in the Senate, I, and our governor all sent a letter to the outdoor retailers who were having two huge conventions every year in Utah, but getting no support from the Utah delegation for public lands. And I'm very pleased to say that that convention has now moved to Denver, Colorado. So that's good stuff.
Thank you, Senator, for being here. I'm also from Colorado.
Where are you from?
I'm from Denver and Boulder. So thank you. GPS.
Did you go to the Denver Public
I
Schools?
did.
Where
yes.
did you go?
Florist at Ebert.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Then you're very smart. That's like the University of Chicago in Denver Public Schools.
Thank you. So I wanted
Two institutions I wouldn't be able to get into. Yes.
You're just being silly. Anyway, so what I wanted to ask was that given the bipartisan nature in politics, we've also seen that there's been, partisan nature in politics. We've also seen this split in the general American population, especially through social media with the increase of echo chambers and not being able to hear opinions on the other side of the aisle. So what would you recommend for everyday citizens of how we can try to reach across party lines to increase efforts of bipartisanship?
I think you should listen to what people are saying on the other side, if for no other reason than you want to understand what they're saying. And so if you are watching, just picking out of thin air, MSNBC for a month, maybe you should spend a week watching Fox. Now that's, I think actually what you should do, the best thing to do of all, would be to turn off the cable television at night and to not watch that stuff, because it's not going to help you make good decisions. I think you should read as broadly as you can. One of the things that I've benefited a lot from in this job is I've got 8 hours a week where I'm flying back and forth to Denver every week. And about 6 years ago, I stopped reading newspapers and I started reading books. And boy, I've got a lot to learn about the way the world works, and I'm learning a lot about the way the world works. And you have the perfect opportunity to do that now. I also think there is I know the million opportunities you have to work together to try to make this community a better place for people to live, either the university or the broader Chicago community or the state of Illinois. And I think that's a place where you could get practice doing this. What I would urge you is to, and I say this to the college interns who come to Washington every summer, they let me talk to them. What I say to them is, one of the things is, that anybody can come to Washington, whether they're an intern or a senator, and repeat the talking points that were on TV last night. That's not hard to do, that's easy to do. But it's not leadership, and it's not the leadership this country needs. And you guys are the leaders this country needs. My job is to try to protect this thing as long as I can so that you will have the opportunity to actually do the wise stuff that we are going to rely on you to do, because you are much more synchronized with the world as it is today than my generation is. I strongly believe that. And that's another thing you could help us figure out, is how to use social media in a way that pushes people together rather than driving them apart.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Ben Nickerson. I'm from Maine.
Where are you from in Maine?
Yarmouth, Maine, Portland. I'm a current law student here at the university, and I'm curious what you envision for the future of the Supreme Court nomination and approval process.
I'm so worried about it, and what I hope is that we end up coming together and saying, let's undo everything we've done. I don't know if any of you are watching Ken Burns' documentary about Vietnam that's on now, but he starts it by starting to run things in backwards. So instead of seeing the helicopters falling into the ocean being pushed, they're running back. Instead of napalm being dropped on people, it's being brought back. I wish we could unwind all of that stuff and get us back to a place where there's a 60-vote threshold. Is that in the Constitution? No. Why is it good? Because it pushes both parties together to have a responsibility to get a result. And what I worry about with the Supreme Court is that traditionally, the nominee had to at least appear like they were open to other people's ideas, and that they weren't, that they weren't fully formed on everything, and they were claiming moderation. Sometimes it wasn't true, sometimes it was true, but that was the goal, was having people on the court that at least had an open mind. I mean, you knew that different presidents would nominate different people. And in most cases, Supreme Court nominees were placed on the court with 90 votes or 80 votes. I mean, if you were qualified, that was the custom. There's only one recent exception, which was Justice Thomas, who was 52-48. Imagine where we've come to, though. He wasn't even filibustered. Joe Biden said, he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and he said at that time, I was in law school when that happened. He said at that time, after the Judiciary Committee voted him down, he said, the Constitution doesn't say the Judiciary Committee shall advise and consent. It says the Senate shall advise and consent. So he moved the nomination forward. And even though senators could have filibustered this man who was so controversial and with a lifetime appointment, it put him on the court 52-48. We can argue whether that was right or whether it was wrong. This is a difference in practice. And now that the rule has been changed to 51, what that means is that when a Democrat is in charge and when Democrats are in charge of the Senate, you will get justices that the farthest left part of the Democratic Party says is acceptable to them. And when a Republican is in charge and a Republican is president, you will get the same thing on the right. And what you will relinquish is any responsibility for the minority party to work with the majority party to make that happen. That is potentially enormously damaging to the court. I can't tell you that for sure, but based on everything I know about human nature, that's going to be really difficult. And we have done that. The Senate has infected the court now with our partisanship for partisan reasons. And it's something I hope we will correct before you're nominated to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Hi, my name is Trent. I'm a first year from Broomfield, Colorado.
All right.
And my question is, what lessons have you learned from being superintendent that you have applied to politics?
Thank you. I feel really fortunate that I came to this job having spent my life outside of politics. And one thing I didn't come up tonight was I was in business before. After I was a lawyer, I went into business. And did I mention that already? No. So I used to be an investor in distressed companies, and I would, on behalf of the person I worked for, buy companies that were really well run but had terrible balance sheets and restructure them in bankruptcy. And strangely enough, a lot of the skills were important in the superintendent's job. I feel fortunate to be in the job that I'm in, having had experience in education and in business, because I can bring that to bear in the discussions that we have in Washington. I think part of the problem we have is that a lot of the people that are back there have spent their whole life running for political office and haven't had experiences that could make them understand what's actually needed. I don't denigrate the experience of running for political office. You learn a lot about yourself and your state and your country, but it's not the exclusive knowledge base that we should have. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have a hard time making deals that people in other contexts might not really have in other experiences. So there's probably not a day that goes by that I don't use those experiences. The other thing I'll just come back to is the changes we were asking our community to make in Denver were really big changes to the Denver Public Schools. And that was a matter of over-communicating and taking blows, you know? If it's often things aren't done because they're hard to do. And when you're in the middle of something that's hard to do, there's a lot of conflict, and you've got to be willing. And that's maybe why I don't search out conflict for conflict's sake, because I want to reserve it for the stuff we really need conflict around. And so I'd say that every single Tea Party town hall meeting I've had, I've relied on the school closing meetings that I had when I was superintendent of schools. I try to be, somebody mentioned the primary that I had. You know, one of the things that I feel lucky about is that I think I can almost say without exception that I have said the same things in my primary races that I've said in my general election races. And I cannot tell you how liberating that is. I see these folks that haven't done that. And these days, when everybody's got a camera at everything that you're doing, like tonight or any town hall, there's no point in not saying the same thing everywhere you go. And as I say, I've found that liberating. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So my name is Aporfa, and I actually interned at your office in Denver this summer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Nice to
it's
see
really
you.
Awesome.
Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, of course. And I just wanted to start with saying, like, your staff is amazing, and
Thank you.
they do a really good
They
job
are.
there. So my question is actually going back to the issue of bipartisanship. Given how polarized the political parties are right now, do you think it's a realistic goal for example, bipartisan immigration reform currently, or is that more of a long-term goal given how?
Well, I think we had every shot of getting it done the last time because the sequence of events was bipartisan bill, bipartisan bill. Ted Cruz shut the government down right after that. John McCain really, at that point, had the whip hand in the caucus. And I can remember him standing on the floor looking at Cruz saying, we're not doing this. We're not. Bob Corker down there saying, I understand you're trying to be on TV, but we really ought to be doing something else. And then what happened, something I can't blame the Republicans for, going back to the bad government discussion. We had a healthcare website rollout failure that was a complete catastrophe. And we have not recovered from that as a party. And that was the final nail in the coffin because people have said, these guys can't even roll out a website. How do you expect them to secure our borders? So I do strongly believe that we will pass comprehensive immigration reform. I used my time with the president to talk about that when I was in the White House. With him, and he said he wanted to pass it. I'm not sure I believed it, but I think he notionally thought he wanted to. But I think it's going to be enormously challenging to get that done while he's president. And I hope he proves me wrong. And in the meantime, what we have to do is make sure that people understand that this rhetoric is inconsistent with our values. And we need to remind people that are here that we want them to be here. And we need to make sure that families aren't being split up. I have people in my state who are no longer going to testify in domestic abuse cases at the courthouse because they are worried that ICE is going to arrest them at the courthouse. How does that help anybody in this country?
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for your advocacy on this. Keep it up.
Sorry. Hi, Senator. My name is Noah. I'm a first year in the college. And last fall, I had the opportunity to work as a state senator back in my home state of Massachusetts, work as a field director for a state senate campaign back in my home state of Massachusetts. And one of the most profound things that I saw every day is that there were people who were so reasonable, so pragmatic on local issues, but when you started talking about national issues, they just became completely ideologically driven. So I'm wondering, how do we inject some of the good things about local politics?
I agree 100% with your observation, and I think that the way in my simple mind, the way I think about that, and I think about it all the time because I was a local official, is that if we simply agreed, all of us tonight, that we would hold our, well, let me speak for Colorado, that we would hold our federal elected officials to the same level of accountability we hold our local elected officials, our mayors, our county commissioners, our school superintendents, a lot of this would be solved. Because there is not a mayor in Colorado, no matter where, and we've got the most liberal parts of America in our state, and we got the most conservative parts of America in our state. And we're proud of that, I think, in Colorado. There is not a mayor who would shut their government down for politics. Not one. There's not a county commissioner that would do it. I went on the floor, just because of your observation, feeling the same way you did. I went on the floor when we were having these, battles back and forth about whether to shut the government down and all this stuff. People going on TV with this principle and that principle. And I did the math on what divided the two parties. And it was equivalent, it would have been equivalent to the mayor of Alamosa, Colorado, which is a small city in the southern part of my state, saying, we agreed on everything in the budget except $23,000, so we're going to shut the government down over $23,000. Or the other example I used was, it would be like if you and I went out to Applebee's for the $20 a meal, and we agreed how to pay on $19.96 of it, but we had a fist fight over the 4 cents. That was the math. And we need better than that out of people that are in these jobs. And I hope that more and more there'll be people running for office in this country who run expecting to hold their principles strongly, but understand that there are people that have different principles than your principles, and that to get a just result for the American people, you need to find a way for those things to come together the way the founders intended, and everything will be okay, which in general I think it will. I mean, we've had a lot of worries tonight, but the reality is those guys in Philadelphia who weren't as democratic as they should have been started an experiment that lasted far longer than any of them ever thought it would. I mean, they would be amazed if they showed up here tonight and found us sitting here 230 years later, still a republic. And not just covering the 13 colonies, but the entire continental United States, coast to coast, plus some other places. And the strongest economy the world has ever known, the greatest capacity for defense that any nation has ever known. And it seems to me the least we can do is try to figure out how to support the architecture they created for us so that another generation of Americans gets to say the same thing. That's what the work is about. And that's why the work is as much your work as it is my work. I really mean that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Senator, once again.
Did you have one, or did you? Okay. Can we just take one last one and then we'll go?
Thank you so much.
I saw you standing there for a long time.
Well, I also wanted to thank you for a gift to middle-aged men like me, the reference to Walter Cronkite. Sorry. Thank you for letting me ask this question. Research I've done lately, this is about Russian interference in our election. Research I've done lately has suggested to me not only did the Trump campaign collude with the Russians, but probably the whole scheme to elect Trump as a president was probably hatched in Moscow in 2013 at the when he took the Miss America pageant to Moscow. Is there anything that you can share with us about Trump's business activities and what investigation may be going on with that and how it is going to impact whatever decision you decide to make?
Well, we haven't, I don't think we have yet seen in the Senate the evidence of collusion. We have seen evidence of, which is not to say it's not there, we have seen evidence of interference, and to use a Donald Trump term, massive interference. And I'm not going to get started on foreign policy because it's too late, but the idea that we've got a guy there, however, whose views is a role of the United States president undermining the EU and undermining NATO and undermining our allies in the region against what the threat that Russia presents, a very real threat, is really problematic. And I think what we've got to do is let the investigations take their course and see where they lead. We don't know anything at all, I don't, about his business interests in Russia. I don't know whether the intelligence committees do or not, but if there's things to figure out, I think the intelligence committees will figure it out. So I appreciate your raising it.
Well, Senator, thank you once again for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us. And
we actually don't do very much, so it's, no, I'm just kidding. Thank you guys for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. It was fun to be with you.